The candlelight flickers across silk curtains, and the scent of jasmine lingers in the still air. You are not a queen, not a wife, not even a woman free to walk the gardens outside these walls, yet the fate of an empire trembles beneath your fingertips. Behind the carved screens, whispers of ministers and soldiers fall silent when your name is spoken. Though you were once nothing but a girl sold to the palace, the bed you sleep in is both your prison and your throne. Chains disguised as silk, power hidden inside vulnerability. Each night, as shadows crawl across the chamber, you wonder, did you conquer this world, or did it conquer you? And if your beauty fades, will the empire you command vanish with it, as swiftly as a candle snuffed out by the wind? The story begins not in the glitter of palaces, but in the quiet hunger of an ordinary home. She was born into a world where girls were coins to be traded, their worth measured by beauty, obedience, and the silence they carried. Her earliest memories were of candle smoke curling in a dark room, her mother's hands rough from work, and whispers about debts too large to pay. When the palace recruiters came, draped in silk and carrying promises of fortune, her family bowed, their heads, not in blessing, but in surrender. She was taken, barely more than a child, her hair plaited neatly as if tidiness could mask terror. The ride to the palace was a blur of rattling wheels, incense burning to steady her nerves, and the weight of knowing she would never return. The palace gates loomed like a mouth swallowing her whole. Beyond them, everything was choreographed. The shuffle of slippers on polished stone, the sweet but suffocating perfume of roses, the sound of silk robes brushing against the floor. Here, names ceased to matter. She was stripped of hers and given a title that marked her rank, nothing more. The other girls studied her with eyes sharpened by desperation, each one a rival in the silent contest for survival. Tutors explained the art of walking slowly, of lowering one's gaze, of laughing softly without revealing too much of the teeth. Every lesson was a rehearsal for a future she could not yet imagine, a world where the curve of her wrist or the softness of her voice could determine her place between obscurity and power. That night, as she lay on her narrow bed, staring at a ceiling painted with dragons and clouds, she whispered her own name into the darkness, clinging to it as a secret rebellion. The palace was already shaping her, sanding down her edges, wrapping her in silk that felt like chains. But beneath the training and the fear, a thought flickered, a dangerous one. If she must live as a shadow, perhaps she could learn how to command the light. Days inside the palace bled into one another, measured not by the sun, but by ritual. At dawn, the sound of bronze gongs rippled through the halls, summoning the concubines to be from their sleep. They moved like shadows through corridors lit by flickering lanterns, the air thick with incense that clung to their skin. Here, even the smallest gestures carried meaning. A girl who walked too quickly was seen as vulgar. One who spoke without being asked was marked as reckless. She learned quickly that silence was safer than truth, and obedience was the only language understood. The instructors were merciless in their refinement. They pressed books on the tops of their heads to teach posture, dipped their hands in bowls of water to train graceful movement, and corrected their laughter until it sounded like music rather than joy. Each girl was a brushstroke in a painting designed not for herself, but for the emperor's gaze. In this place, individuality was scrubbed away, replaced by the illusion of perfection. But perfection was not freedom. It was performance. At night, when the palace quieted, she would sneak glances at the carved screens that separated their quarters from the deeper chambers where the emperor resided. Behind those latticed walls, decisions were made that shaped armies, nations, and lives. Yet for her and the others, the only future lay in waiting, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be noticed, waiting for a fate that could exalt or destroy. She watched how some of the girls embraced the rules with desperation, adorning themselves in borrowed jewels, whispering flattery to attendants, hoping to be remembered. Others fell into despair, their beauty wilting before it was ever seen. She hovered between them, her heart restless. She hated the way her reflection in polished bronze no longer looked like the child she once was. Yet, beneath her obedience, she began to memorize the patterns of the palace, the hierarchy of eunuchs, the subtle exchanges of servants, the invisible strings that guided life here. She was learning quietly that survival was not just about pleasing the emperor. It was about understanding power itself. Her first true test came sooner than expected. One evening, the palace gathered the young concubines for inspection, a ritual cloaked in ceremony but sharpened with cruelty. The hall glowed with 100 candles, their flames reflected in gilded mirrors, creating the illusion of endless light. Perfume clung to the air so heavily it felt suffocating, and silk rustled like whispers as the girls stood in trembling lines. Eunuchs walked slowly among them, their expression unreadable, noting every blemish, every flaw, every sign of weakness. She kept her head lowered, her hands folded perfectly, though her pulse hammered in her ears. When the emperor entered, silence consumed the room. She had expected a man of myth, a figure larger than life. Instead, he was simply human. Yet the weight of the empire seemed to bend the air around him. His gaze slid across the rows of faces like a blade. She felt it pause, just for an instant. On her, that single glance, fleeting and uncertain, struck her harder than any touch. She realized then that the emperor's attention was not love, nor even interest. It was opportunity, a currency more dangerous than gold. Later, in the privacy of her quarters, she replayed that moment again and again, torn between fear and exhilaration. She thought of her family, who had traded her future for coin, and wondered if they imagined her standing beneath the emperor's eye. She thought of the other girls, some already collapsing under the weight of jealousy and despair, and asked herself whether she would be one of them, or something else entirely. That night, she lay awake as the moonlight filtered through carved, lattice windows, drawing patterns of cages across the floor. She understood at last. The palace was a stage, and she was being taught to play her role. But if she performed it well enough, perhaps she could step beyond the screen and seize control of the script itself. What began as survival was slowly becoming ambition, and ambition had a way of swallowing everything it touched. The palace was beautiful, but its beauty was a cage, every column carved with dragons, every courtyard blooming with peonies, every silk curtain fluttering in the breeze, seemed designed not for freedom, but for control. Here, desire was politics, and intimacy was war. She quickly learned that the emperor's bed was not the only battlefield. His silence, his glances, his passing words could crown a girl or condemn her to obscurity. And so the concubines sharpened themselves into weapons, their smiles edged like blades hidden beneath velvet. She watched carefully, never rushing, never stepping too far ahead. Others moved too quickly, flaunting their beauty, parading their voices, only to vanish within weeks, banished to cold chambers, or sent away under whispers of illness. Those who survived learned the quiet art of balance, enough allure to be remembered, enough humility to seem harmless. She copied their gestures, but she also noticed the cracks, the way a trusted eunuch hesitated before bowing, the way certain ministers left gifts at the hands of favored women. These were not signs of affection, they were signs of power. Her first taste of this power came not in the emperor's arms, but in a whispered request. A maidservant approached her with trembling hands, begging her to speak a kind word on her behalf to the steward of linens. It was a trivial thing, but when the request was granted, the maidservant's loyalty became absolute. That night, as she lay beneath embroidered blankets, she realized the truth. Influence could be built long before one reached the emperor's side. Power was not given. It was cultivated, gathered thread by thread like silk woven into a tapestry. Yet each thread carried danger. Whispers of rivalry thickened around her like smoke. Girls who once laughed at her in training now looked at her with sharpened eyes. Even the touch of perfume on her sleeve could be twisted into rumor. She was no longer just a girl surviving in the palace. She was becoming a player in its endless, ruthless game. The emperor summoned her only rarely at first, but even rare nights carried consequences. The ritual of preparation was itself a ceremony of power. Attendants brushed her hair until it gleamed like dark lacquer, perfumed her wrists with sandalwood, and draped her in robes embroidered with gold thread phoenixes. The air in those chambers was heavy, fragrant, intoxicating, yet beneath it all lay fear. The knowledge that a single misstep, a single word out of place, could end everything. When she entered his presence, she bowed so low her forehead nearly touched the polished floor, her heart pounding as if it might give her away. The emperor's gaze lingered on her longer now, a silent acknowledgement that carried more weight than titles. After those nights, her rank rose. Eunuchs bowed lower in the corridors. Rival concubines whispered her name with bitterness, and small favors began flowing her way. Extra fabrics, better rooms, attendants eager to serve, but with each gift came poison. Some girls accidentally spilled hot tea near her hand. Others let their envy fester into schemes, leaving shards of glass beneath her slippers, hoping she would stumble. The harem was not just silk and music. It was daggers drawn behind painted fans. She never confronted her rivals directly. Instead, she learned the art of invisibility and patience. When a concubine tried to frame her with stolen jewels, she remained silent while the eunuchs investigated. When the truth surfaced, the guilty girl was banished to a remote wing of the palace, never to be seen again. Victory, she discovered, often required stillness rather than strike. But in her stillness, she grew sharper. She studied the emperor's moods, the way his temper softened when he drank plum wine, the way he listened more closely when flattered through stories rather than direct praise. She was no longer the frightened girl who whispered her name in the dark. She was learning the secret truth of the harem. Chains of silk could bind, but they could also strangle, if she learned to pull them tight. By now, her life was a constant performance, every gesture weighed and calculated. When she walked through the courtyards, she moved like a drifting petal, her silence more commanding than words. When she laughed, it was never too loud, never too soft, but precisely tuned to echo what the emperor wanted to hear. She had become fluent in the invisible language of survival, where glances were weapons and smiles were shields. Yet the more she played this game, the more she felt the cost of it gnawing at her. Loneliness stalked her like a shadow. Even surrounded by attendants, by jewels and silks, by the endless music of zithers and flutes drifting through the halls, she felt the absence of something real. Every friendship was fragile, every kindness conditional, every secret whispered into the dark carried the risk of betrayal. At night she sometimes dreamed of her mother's calloused hands, of a home that smelled of earth and firewood rather than incense and perfumed smoke. But the palace allowed no nostalgia. Memory itself felt dangerous, like a weakness she could not afford. And yet, despite the emptiness, her influence grew. She began to notice ministers requesting her intercession, cloaked in subtle words. A gift of rare jade appeared in her chamber, accompanied by a request that she remind the emperor of a certain decree. She understood then that she was no longer just a concubine in waiting. She was becoming a channel, a gatekeeper to the throne. Her bed was transforming into a throne of its own, a place where whispers could ripple outward and shape the destiny of the empire. Still, every victory felt fragile, as if it might collapse. With a single shift of the emperor's attention, she had gained power, yes, but it was power borrowed, balanced on the edge of desire and suspicion. And as she drifted to sleep one night, the moonlight casting cage-like patterns across her floor, she wondered, was she mastering the palace, or was the palace mastering her? By the time whispers of her name reached the highest halls of government, she no longer needed to speak loudly. The emperor leaned toward her in moments of fatigue, asking questions he did not ask his ministers, listening when her voice was softest. It began with simple things, suggesting which music might soothe his mood, which courtyards to stroll when he was restless. But soon, those suggestions curved into matters of state. She would speak of a certain governor's loyalty or hint at the reliability of a general. The emperor believed these were his own conclusions, yet they were words she had planted. Like seeds dropped into fertile soil, her bedchamber, perfumed, with sandalwood and veiled in silk, became an unseen council chamber. Ministers who once ignored her now trembled when they passed, for they knew that one word in the night could alter their future. She was never seen at the grand councils, never allowed to sit among the officials, but decisions bore her fingerprints. Soldiers were sent to war, taxes were shifted, alliances tightened, all because of murmurs spoken while the emperor rested his head against her lap. And yet she played her part with flawless grace. Before others, she was the quiet jewel of the harem, deferential and unassuming, her eyes lowered in humility. Only the emperor knew the sharper edge beneath her silence, and even he believed it was adoration, not strategy, that guided her. The silken chains of the palace had not broken her. She had learned to wrap them around her hands and wield them like reins. But in the stillness of night, when attendants had gone, and even the emperor's breathing had grown heavy with sleep, she would stare at the ceiling painted with golden stars. A single thought haunted her. If her power lived only through his desire, then it was a throne built on sand, and sand, no matter how tightly it is clenched, always slips away. Her influence reached its height during a season of unrest. Border rebellions stirred, officials quarreled in court, and the emperor's health wavered under the weight of it all. Where others saw chaos, she saw opportunity. She became his calm in the storm, her voice weaving reassurance as gently as silk draped across the skin. When ministers urged harsh punishments, she counseled patience. When generals demanded more soldiers, she whispered caution, and more often than not, the emperor followed her counsel. The court began to sense it. Some whispered that her touch had bewitched him, others that she was possessed by spirits guiding her hand. None dared to speak openly, for the emperor's temper was quick, and his loyalty to her unshakable. But the rumors only strengthened her legend. Servants bowed lower, eunuchs carried her commands with trembling hands, and rivals in the harem watched in bitter silence, powerless to challenge her. She no longer needed to scheme for attention. Attention now revolved around her, but with every rise came shadows. Ministers who feared her influence formed secret alliances, crafting plans to weaken her. Jealous concubines plotted from the corners of silk-draped chambers, offering poisoned perfumes or tainted teas. She moved through the palace as if walking, across a lake of thin ice, smiling gracefully while listening for cracks beneath her feet. Trust was impossible. Even the gentle hands that dressed her hair might one day betray her. One night, while the emperor slept beside her, she sat awake, listening to the distant howl of wind across the palace roofs. She thought of the girl she once was, the child, sold, trained, reshaped. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman draped in silk and shadows, powerful enough to command armies, yet still confined to a single bedchamber. It was a triumph, yes, but also a prison gilded so beautifully it almost disguised its bars. The empire now moved to the rhythm of her whispers. Victories in distant provinces were toasted in the emperor's name, yet she knew the roots of those triumphs began in the hushed tones of their private chamber. Even the most seasoned generals grew cautious, for behind the curtain of silk lay a woman whose influence rivaled their swords. The harem, once a world of rivalry and survival, had become her court, and the bed that once bound her was now the seat of her reign. But the higher she rose, the more fragile her footing became. She began to sense the emperor's shifting moods, the moments when his eyes lingered on younger concubines, when his laughter rang louder in their presence. It was subtle, fleeting, yet to her it felt like the earth cracking beneath a palace wall. She tightened her grip where she could, showering him with affection, reminding him of their shared triumphs, weaving herself into his memory as inseparable from his power. Still, She knew beauty was a fleeting currency, and the court was already hungry for her downfall. One evening, a trusted eunuch warned her in hushed tones. A minister had accused her of meddling too boldly, of speaking words beyond her station. The emperor silenced the accusation with anger, but the seed had been planted. For the first time, she felt the cold edge of fear return, not of rivals, but of losing him, and with him, the empire she had come to command. That night she lay awake, staring at the canopy above her, its embroidered dragons seeming to coil and tighten like serpents. She wondered if she had built her kingdom upon silk or upon chains, whether she had truly ruled, or whether she had only been permitted to believe she did. In her chest, ambition still burned, but it was now laced with dread. For the first time, she realized her power was not eternal. It was borrowed, and soon the debt would come due. The change was almost imperceptible at first. A strand of silver in her hair, a faint line etched at the corner of her mouth, the subtle heaviness in her eyes after sleepless nights. The palace mirrors, once her allies, now became her enemies, reflecting back the cruel arithmetic of time. Attendants still praised her beauty, their voices trembling with the obligation to flatter. But she could feel the shift in the air. How the emperor's gaze no longer lingered as it once did. How his footsteps turned more often toward the chambers of younger concubines whose laughter rang like bells in the night. Whispers slithered through the corridors. She heard them in the rustle of silk, in the hushed tones of servants, that she was losing her hold, that her time was fading. Ministers who once sought her favor now approached others, testing the waters. Of new alliances, the eunuchs who had carried her commands with trembling respect began to move more cautiously, waiting to see where true power would settle. The empire she had spun around herself like a silken cocoon was beginning to fray, and yet she refused to vanish quietly. She adorned herself in brighter robes, layered her eyes with kohl, perfumed her chambers so heavily that the scent lingered long after she left. She fought against decline with every thread of silk, every jeweled ornament, every carefully rehearsed smile. Still, beneath the surface, she felt the truth pressing in. The empire no longer revolved solely around her. She had ruled from her bed, but the bed was not eternal. One evening, as she sat before her mirror, watching a candle burn lower and lower, she realized that her greatest fear had arrived. It was not betrayal, not poison, not even death. It was the slow erasure of significance. The moment when the empire no longer trembled at her name. The emperor's affection was a tide, and now it was receding. Nights that once belonged to her were spent elsewhere, behind doors that echoed with the soft voices of girls half her age. When she passed them in the courtyards, they lowered their eyes with practiced humility, but she could feel their triumph radiating like heat. Their youth was her undoing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the silence of her chambers, she clenched her hands until her nails bit into her palms, furious at how the empire measured a woman's worth in the bloom of her face rather than the sharpness of her mind. Yet she did not surrender. She had spent years weaving herself into the very fabric of power, and she refused to be torn out so easily. If beauty was slipping, then wisdom would take its place. She began cultivating allies in the shadows, old eunuchs whose loyalty she had bought with kindness, ministers who remembered her counsel in their rise, servants who owed her favors. Though her access to the emperor was dwindling, she could still pull threads from behind the curtain. Every whispered reminder, every subtle suggestion carried her voice farther than her presence could. Still, the loneliness deepened. Where once she had been surrounded by attendants eager to please, now there were pauses, hesitations, unspoken doubts in their eyes. She felt the walls closing in, not with malice, but with indifference. The greatest cruelty of the palace was not betrayal, it was being forgotten. One night she sat by her window as the wind rattled the lanterns outside, and she whispered to herself the truth no one dared speak. She had built an empire from her bed, but empires do not mourn their builders. They consume them, then move on to the next. The thought was both bitter and liberating. If she was to fade, she would fade not as a discarded concubine, but as a legend who had ruled in silence where kings and ministers had shouted in vain. The years pressed on, and though she disguised her fears behind silk and ceremony, time was a more ruthless rival than any concubine. A streak of silver crept into her hair, faint but undeniable, and the reflection in her bronze mirror became a battlefield where she fought to recognize herself. She applied powders, perfumes, and tinctures, each a futile attempt to freeze the moment when she had first captured the emperor's gaze. But mirrors do not lie, and neither do memories. She remembered the night he had called her the brightest jewel of his palace. Yet now his compliments were reserved for others whose faces glowed with the unmarked smoothness of youth. Her influence lingered, but its weight diminished. Ministers still sought her opinion in hushed tones, yet their deference was cautious, as though they feared her fading favour might tarnish them too. Even the eunuchs, once her spies, her whisperers, began to glance over their shoulders before carrying her words. The palace had shifted its centre of gravity, and she felt herself spinning farther from its core with every passing season. In her solitude, she began writing letters she never sent, fragments of thoughts inked onto delicate paper. Some were prayers, others curses, and many confessions that she dared not speak aloud. She wrote of her hatred for the system that used her, of the hunger for love she never truly received, and of the irony that she, who had ruled an empire through beauty, was now condemned by its loss. These letters, hidden beneath the floorboards of her chamber, became her final audience, an invisible court where she was both queen and prisoner. Still, she did not collapse into despair. There was steel beneath her sorrow, the same steel that had lifted her from obscurity to supremacy. She knew her name would not vanish entirely. Even if the emperor forgot, even if the courtiers moved on, the walls of the palace had heard her, the servants had watched her, and history had already carved her presence into its stone. She would not be remembered as a fading flower, but as the woman who taught an empire how dangerous beauty could be. When her final days arrived, they passed not with the fanfare of drums or the shimmer of jewels, but in silence. The emperor no longer called for her, the courtiers no longer bowed as deeply, and the palace that had once revolved around her seemed to exhale her out of its memory. She died quietly, behind the embroidered curtains of her chamber. Her name spoken only in whispers, as if acknowledging her meant confronting the truth of every woman who had lived and perished within those gilded walls. There was no grand mourning for her, no monuments built, only a modest ceremony and the discreet removal of her belongings. Yet absence has a way of speaking louder than presence, and in the hush that followed her death, the palace itself seemed to mourn. For the young women who replaced her, she became both a warning and a prophecy. They walked through the same corridors, painted their faces in the same mirrors, and carried the same fragile hope that beauty might outlast time. But every step echoed her story. Every glance at their reflection reminded them that one day they too would fade. The court historians recorded her name in passing, reduced her to titles and dates, but the truth of her power lingered in unrecorded whispers. Servants remembered the weight of her gaze, eunuchs remembered the sharpness of her commands, and concubines remembered the fear she inspired. Her legacy was not written in marble or ink, but in the invisible scars she left on the system itself. She had proved that beauty could be more dangerous than armies, more persuasive than treaties, and more enduring than crowns. Yet she also revealed the cruelty of a world where a woman's worth was measured not by her mind or her will, but by the youth of her skin. In the end, her story was not merely about rise and fall, but about a question that outlived her. What becomes of a woman when the empire she built upon her beauty decides it no longer needs her? That question lingered, unanswered, like a ghost wandering the corridors of history.